At my own family's dinner table, my father raised a glass and called me a freeloader in front of everyone. No joke, no hesitation. Just years of silence turned into a public insult. But the next day, his boss stood in a room full of executives, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "Good morning, ma'am." Why was I invisible in my own family, but respected by the people they desperately wanted to impress? What happens when the one they dismissed turns out to outrank them all? The moment I pulled into the driveway, the porch light flickered just like it used to, always a beat behind, like it wasn't sure whether to welcome me or warn me away. The air had that soft bite of early fall, crisp and quiet. I stepped out of the car, heels crunching the gravel, and took a long breath. It had been years, but everything looked preserved, like a snapshot. No one dared update it. Inside, the smell was the same. Lemons and old wood polish. The hallway still had that squeaky third plank I used to skip as a kid, and the photos lined up with mathematical precision. Baby pictures of Julian, high school awards, family vacations, but none of me in uniform. Not one. Not even a graduation shot. Like I had been cropped out of our collective memory. Walter was already pacing the living room, phone to his ear, glancing at his watch every few seconds. Julian, as expected, stood by the mantel, wine glass in hand, animatedly describing some leadership theory he'd borrowed from a podcast. Marlene, ever the orchestrator, fluttered out of the kitchen. Her smile was practiced. "Well, look who finally showed," she said. Not a hug, not a real greeting, just mild surprise. I nodded. "Good to see you too, Mom." Her eyes flicked toward Julian. "Go on in. We've got a slideshow for your brother's big promotion. He made senior project lead last quarter. Impressive, right?" "Of course," I said, offering a polite smile. The dining room had been dressed up. Candles, place settings, even a little podium for speeches. My name wasn't on any card. I didn't expect it to be. I took the last seat at the edge of the table beside the kitchen doorway, half hidden behind the server cart. From here, I could see it all without being seen. Dinner began with fanfare. Julian took center stage in every anecdote. Every laugh seemed to orbit around him. I ate quietly, listening, waiting. At some point, Marlene leaned over and whispered, "Sorry we forgot to send you the invite. Assumed you were too busy." I didn't bother correcting her. There was no forgot. I had texted a week ago, told her I was flying in. She'd replied with a thumbs up emoji. Walter stood and tapped his glass. "To Julian," he started, "for rising through merit, not shortcuts." Everyone clapped. Julian raised his glass in faux modesty. Walter continued, "Some people take initiative. Others just coast along, freeloading. Well, that only works until people wise up." Heads turned. Laughter bubbled. Forks paused midair. Someone snorted behind a napkin. I froze. He didn't say my name, but he didn't have to. The silence after his words wrapped around me like a noose. I felt my spine straighten, hands steadying the knife next to my plate. Julian chuckled low. "Well said, Dad." I said nothing. Didn't flinch. But inside, something cracked. Not loud, but sharp and clean. I stared down at my plate, watching the candlelight flicker in the gravy. This wasn't new. This was a rerun. I remembered all the other times, forgotten birthdays, skipped ceremonies, the quiet corrections they'd make when it's talked about my work, always downplaying anything outside their corporate comfort zone. The scholarship mistake, that's what they used to call it behind closed doors when I joined the service. Could have been a lawyer, they said. Could have worked at a real firm. Marlene leaned in again. "Let's not ruin this night. It's Julian's moment." Of course it was. I nodded, not in agreement, in calculation. After dessert, I slipped away from the table into the hallway. The laughter echoed behind me as I pulled out my phone, tapping through the secure portal from work. Tomorrow's agenda was already uploaded. Defense contract review, military-civilian integration. There it was, my name, listed in bold. Colonel Voss, Principal Advisor, Cybersecurity Division. They had no idea. I stared at the screen for a second longer, the glow reflecting off the framed family photo beside me, one where I had been cropped out long ago. I whispered to myself, voice flat but certain. Let's see who freeloads who tomorrow. The slideshow started with the familiar click of an old remote and a jittery transition into Julian's curated legacy. He stood beside the screen like a proud professor, chin lifted slightly, as if the story it told was universally agreed upon. Everyone leaned in. I leaned back. I watched quietly until one slide, a group shot from his first corporate startup pitch. I remembered that one. I'd helped finance it, quietly. An early check written under my personal LLC to avoid scrutiny. I'd been in that photo. I knew exactly where I stood. Left corner, hand on the whiteboard, face half turned. Except now I wasn't. The photo had been cropped. You could still see my arm, just the sleeve edge, and the outline of a wristwatch I no longer owned. A surgically erased presence. A deliberate vanishing. I didn't flinch. I sipped my wine. Marlene clapped at the next picture like she was the mother of a movie star. Then she announced, "Let's raise a glass to Naomi for making tonight possible. The food, the wine, the decorations. You really outdid yourself, sweetheart." The room echoed with polite affirmations. I turned to Naomi. She didn't look at me right away, just stared at her glass. When she finally glanced over, it was brief, apologetic, but her mouth didn't move. Not one correction. Weeks ago, I had wired Marlene a few $1,000s. She'd insisted they were running tight with Julian's new car and the catering down payment, but she hadn't wanted Walter to know she asked, so I sent it through Naomi's account. Discreet. Untraceable. Family, right? I raised my glass too. "To Naomi," I said, voice steady. Julian stood again. He always loved standing during toasts. I always tell my team, ideas are nice, but success is about showing up. No one remembers who had the idea. They remember who signed the deal. Chuckles, laughter, a slow clap from someone at the table. Eyes slid toward me. Not hard stares, just passing glances, measuring, confirming. I didn't exist in this story, and they were all fine with that. I wanted to ask, so when I funded your first prototype, was I showing up, or just writing a check from the shadows? But I didn't. I just tilted my glass and took another small sip. When the slideshow ended, everyone clapped again. I smiled, lips only. Later, I slipped into the kitchen, found a pen and a stack of folded napkins, pulled one free, and wrote 2 words across the linen. Military review. I folded it, slid it into my bag, and walked back to the table like nothing happened. As I sat down, I whispered under my breath, "Tomorrow, no cropping me out." The dishes clinked softly as I stacked them, one over the other, in rhythm with the silence that had settled in the kitchen. No one had asked me to help. No one noticed that I did. It was just something ingrained in me from years of living in this house. When you're overlooked, you move in the background. My mind drifted back to a winter 8 years ago. I had sent my father a prototype I designed during my time in an early military R&D unit, a compact navigation module that eventually became the standard for secure vehicle communication across multiple divisions. Back then, it was just a polished set of blueprints in a neat envelope with a handwritten note. "Thought you might have fun testing this." He never replied. A week later, I called to check if it had arrived. Marlene answered, said Walter was busy. "And honestly," she added, "you should focus on a career that's a little more grounded. All this tech talk, it's over people's heads." So I let it go, filed it away under things they pretended not to understand. As I dried my hands, I heard chuckling from the living room. Julian again, bragging about some client dinner. I walked out and leaned against the entryway near the fireplace, pretending to check my phone. That's when I heard it. "Oh, Walter, an older man's voice. "Mr. Bennett, a longtime family friend. That design piece you gave me last year. Still have it on my desk. Everyone asks where I got it. It's brilliant." Walter let out a modest laugh. "Glad you liked it. Rare find, that one." I turned my head. Sitting beside the hearth was a polished wooden box with a metal edge and an embedded microcircuit. Not a decoration. It was my prototype, slightly modified. He had rewrapped my invention and handed it off as a novelty gift. I walked closer. Not a word. Just stood there, looking at it like I'd never seen it before. Bennett nodded toward it. "That thing. I swear it's like something out of a defense lab." I looked at Walter. He met my eyes for a brief second, just enough for me to see that he knew I knew. Then he looked away. No explanation, no acknowledgement. I stepped outside. The air was cold and dry. My breath fogged as I stared at the yard I once mowed every Saturday morning. Lights glowed from the dining room. Laughter carried faintly through the walls. Did they remember what I'd done? What I'd built? Or was it just easier to pretend I had never done anything at all? They didn't want the story of the daughter who worked with classified materials, who filed patents before 30. They wanted Julian's clean, predictable climb. My narrative didn't fit their framing. But that didn't mean I was going to stay quiet forever. Back upstairs, I pulled out tomorrow's project specs. The contract Sentinel had just entered was built on a foundation I helped design. My name wasn't on the public documents, but the source code in the security layer was mine. Unchanged, uncredited, but traceable. I didn't need their applause. I just needed them to finally sit at a table where I held the pen. I reached for the envelope tucked into the interior pocket of my briefcase. The original patent registration, still valid, still mine. I set my alarm for 5:45 a.m., slipped the envelope into my purse, and whispered to myself in the dark. If they refuse to remember me, I'll make it impossible to forget me. I pulled into the parking lot just as the sun broke the horizon. The light skimmed across the glass facade of Sentinel Defense's regional headquarters, reflecting off steel edges like a silent warning. My tires rolled into the designated military liaison space, clearly marked, deliberately chosen. I stepped out in full uniform, regulation cut, polished brass. Not a costume, not a message, just protocol. The security guard at the entrance straightened when he saw me. "Good morning, Colonel Voss," he said, then tapped his earpiece. "She's here." I nodded once. "Thank you. No need for more." Inside, the lobby buzzed with nervous energy. I knew who'd be waiting. Sure enough, Julian stood with Walter near the reception desk, both in matching navy blazers. Their posture told me everything. Relaxed, expectant. They were still speculating about who the military rep might be. Then the elevator doors opened. I stepped out. The silence hit instantly. Julian's eyes flicked to my rank first. He didn't recognize my face. Walter looked twice, mouth opening, closing, then twisting slightly. "What are you doing here dressed like that?" he asked, tone caught between acquaintance and embarrassment. I checked my watch. "Your meeting starts in 20 minutes. You should get ready." I didn't wait for a response, just walked past them without looking back. The conference floor was quiet. The CEO's assistant met me outside the executive war room. "Colonel, we've got your place set. Nameplate's already up." I entered. My name was there at the front corner. Colonel Voss, Key Liaison, Department of Defense. Just as I was sinking into my notes, a message buzzed on the secure work tablet from IT. "Unusual login detected. Last night. Access point Sentinel HQ. File accessed. Internal military contract review V2. Only one person in this building had both motive and misplaced confidence. Julian." I didn't react. I just flagged it for audit and mentally added it to the list. The room began to fill. Senior engineers, corporate officers, civilian contractors. Walter stepped in a few minutes later, eyes darting everywhere but mine. Julian followed, fiddling with his tablet, trying too hard to appear calm. As the CEO entered, the room stilled. She nodded once at me respectfully, then turned toward the crowd. That's when Walter leaned toward me, voice low and stiff. "So, are you here to observe?" I looked at him. Really looked. "No," I said. "I'm here to approve." I had just stepped out of the prep room when I saw Marlene walking toward me. That strange expression she always wore when pretending to be warm. She glanced over her shoulder before stopping in front of me, hand already reaching into her purse. "Sweetheart," she said, lowering her voice, "I didn't want you to feel left out today." She slipped a small white envelope into my hand. "Use this for yourself. Get a coffee, a new blouse, something nice. Just maybe stay toward the back of the room so Julian doesn't feel distracted." She smiled like she'd done something generous, then walked away before I could say anything. 10 minutes later, alone in the side hallway, I opened it. Inside was a folded receipt for a petty cash withdrawal from the department budget. $100, labeled Guest Discretionary. She'd handed me embezzled money disguised as kindness, as if buying my silence was something casual, thoughtful even. I refolded it and tucked it into my coat pocket, not to keep, but to log. I had already forwarded the earlier flag about Julian's unauthorized access. Now this. They weren't just trying to erase me. They were trying to pay me off. Back in the conference room, I moved to my assigned seat, still under the Department of Defense nameplate, the same spot Marlene had asked me to avoid. Julian was at the other end. When he saw me lay my folder down, he gave a forced laugh, loud enough for nearby staff to hear. "What's in the folder, Colonel? More Army trivia?" A few junior staffers chuckled, unsure if they were supposed to. I said nothing. I calmly opened the folder, flipped it once, and placed a document face up on the table. The Pentagon seal glinted under the fluorescent lights. Not showmanship. Jurisdiction. The laughter died. No one asked what was inside after that. During the break, I found Walter standing at the espresso station, avoiding eye contact. I stood beside him. "One more stunt like that," I said, voice low but firm, "and it won't be a family matter anymore. It'll be federal." He turned slowly, face paling. "You wouldn't do that to your own father." "I wouldn't do that to any father," I replied. "But I would absolutely do it to a man misusing federal funds and compromising a defense contract. And I'm authorized to do so." He didn't respond. Just stood there, coffee forgotten, staring into a future he hadn't planned for. When the room reconvened, my placard had been replaced. Guest of Walter Kessler. I stared at it for one long, slow breath. Before I could react, the CEO, Diane Sorensen, entered through the side door. She looked at me, then at the placard. Without a word, she picked it up, tore it in half, and wrote a new one. Colonel Voss, key partner. She slid it into place like it had been there all along. She addressed the room, then turned first to me and said clearly, in front of everyone, "Good morning, ma'am. We're honored to have you here." Every sound in the room ceased at once. Coffee cups hovered in midair. Julian's hand froze on his keyboard, his jaw twitching. Walter didn't blink. Probably couldn't. I nodded once and opened my notes, outlining the integration scope for the cybersecurity module already tested with government partners, noting timeline discrepancies, proposing an oversight shift, all in under 5 minutes. No one interrupted. Across the room, Julian squirmed. Someone near the back whispered, "Wait, I thought she was Walter's assistant or something." I continued as if I hadn't heard, laying out the next phase deliverables and access requirements. Then I looked up and said casually, "Just a reminder, all personnel clearance levels must match their actual project roles. Mislabeling leads to operational risk." The words landed like a dropped file in a silent room. No one spoke. Not even Marlene, who fumbled her pen and had to bend down to retrieve it. As people rose for the break, Julian stopped beside me, face caught somewhere between pale and flushed. "Why didn't you tell us who you were?" he asked, barely above a whisper. I leaned just close enough for only him to hear. You never asked. You just assumed. After lunch, the temperature in the room dropped figuratively. Julian's name came up on the screen for the next presentation, a diagram of the secure communication interface layered within the new architecture. My architecture. I didn't raise my voice. I simply lifted my hand and spoke clearly. That slide was authored under Military Research Unit 43, submitted via encrypted channel to the Department of Defense 11 months ago. File hash and timestamp confirm origin. The silence was instantaneous and surgical. Julian froze mid-gesture. What? I stood, opened my folder for the first time, and retrieved a printed document. Original source code metadata, notarized by the Federal Project Registrar. I handed it to the COO. You've been using my framework, I said calmly. I never asked for credit until now. I pulled out a copy of the contract, sealed and countersigned. Initial strategic investor, security consultant, I said, tapping the signature line. This signature has been in your system for nearly 2 years. Julian took a step back, eyes darting like he was searching for a door that didn't exist. Walter cleared his throat. There must be some misunderstanding. I didn't give him the grace of eye contact. There isn't. The COO leaned closer to the document. Timestamp and digital chain checks out. It's hers, fully. Marlene said nothing. Neither did Julian. I sat down without another word. Let them sit with the truth. Not bitterness. Consequence. A few minutes later, Diane walked over quietly. Would you be willing to address the executive board tomorrow morning? I closed the folder. I'd prefer today. The plaque was taller than I expected. Brushed steel, matte finish, mounted on the main wall between the executive boardroom and the internal media center. Diane waited until the very end of the day to unveil it. Walter, Julian, and Marlene stood among the executives, all stiff and silent, as she pulled the cover free. National Partnership Heroes, the heading read. My name wasn't at the bottom, tucked in with the others. It was centered. My photo was from a formal ceremony, one I never told my family about because they were too busy to attend. Full uniform, silver insignia, gleaming. The caption below read, Invisible until it mattered, then irreplaceable. There was no applause, no gasps, just silence. But it wasn't confusion. It was recognition. Someone behind me whispered that they hadn't known I'd led that field program. A camera clicked. Walter stared at the plaque like it had personally betrayed him. Marlene stood too far behind him to feign pride, too close to feign ignorance. Julian muttered something that didn't quite reach my ears, something like, "We should have seen this coming." No one replied. Diane turned to me shortly after. Got 5 minutes? Her office was quiet. She poured water for both of us, then sat across the table. I'd like you to stay on longer, she said. Advisory capacity, not just for this contract. I smiled softly. Not because I'm bitter, Diane, but I can't. She raised an eyebrow. Because of them, I said. Because they'd ask why I didn't say anything sooner, and I'm not interested in explaining to people who decided they knew me better than I did. She nodded slowly. Some things speak loudest when said by others. We shook hands. She didn't press. As I stepped into the hallway, the energy had shifted. People nodded now, not out of politeness, but respect. Marlene followed me for a few steps, not calling my name, just walking beside me quietly. If you'd told us what you were really doing, she said, eyes brimming, we would have been proud. No, I answered calmly. You would have told me to stop. Her face crumpled. She didn't cry. She didn't apologize. She just stood there. As I walked toward the elevator, I heard my voice echo inside my head. soft but solid. They called me a freeloader, but today they work for my standard. Later that evening, just before the janitor turned off the main hallway lights, Walter stood alone in front of the plaque. His coat hung over his arm, his mouth pressed into a line. "You never needed us, did you?" he whispered. Somewhere inside that space, my voice answered him, low and steady. "I only needed to stop needing your permission." 6 months later, I stood in my kitchen, stirring a pot of tomato bisque. The scent of garlic and thyme curled through the condo like an old friend. The knock came right on time. Not eager, not hesitant, just scheduled. I wiped my hands on a dish towel and opened the door. Walter stood first, holding a bottle of wine awkwardly in one hand and a framed magazine clipping in the other. Marlene was behind him, carrying a dish wrapped in foil. Julian trailed a step back, empty-handed but freshly shaved. "Smells good," Walter offered, voice gravelly but soft. We weren't sure what to bring." I stepped aside. "Come in. It was just a Wednesday. No holiday, no birthday, just a moment someone had decided was overdue." Dinner was fine, quiet, careful. Julian complimented the soup twice. Marlene commented on how organized everything was. Walter stayed mostly silent, eyes occasionally sweeping the bookshelves, the coffee table, the hallway, like he was still trying to piece together the woman who lived here. Over dessert, Marlene cleared her throat. "We didn't know," she said, eyes fixed on the rim of her teacup, "what you'd done, what you were doing, how far you'd gone." I nodded slowly, setting down my fork. "You didn't ask. You didn't want to know." Silence followed, the heavy, respectful kind, the kind that says more than a dozen apologies ever could. Walter reached down beside him and lifted the frame he'd brought. "This hangs in my office now," he said, turning it so I could see. It was the article from the plaque unveiling, my photo, my quote. He tapped the glass gently. "Should have done that with your commissioning photo years ago." I didn't cry, but I did swallow hard before replying. "Thank you." Julian shifted in his seat, looked down at his hands, then back at me. "You weren't just ahead of us," he said. "You were somewhere we didn't even know existed." I smiled, not to soften, just to acknowledge. "It was never about being ahead," I said. "It was about being." The moment stretched just long enough. Then I stood, collected the plates, and moved to the kitchen. "I'll put on some coffee." They stayed another hour, talked about work, about weather. Marlene mentioned a friend from church. Walter asked if I still ran. It was small, but it was something. After they left, I locked the door, leaned against it, and breathed. Later that week, I sat at my desk at the defense office, mentoring a new recruit on compliance protocols. She asked if it ever got easier, being underestimated. "No," I said, "but it gets quieter. Sometimes justice doesn't come with applause. It comes with peace, with silence where the shame used to echo. They don't define me anymore. I do." If there's one thing I've learned, it's that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's survival. And sometimes it's the only way to hear your own voice again after years of being talked over. I used to think being acknowledged by my family would finally validate everything I've built. But what I discovered is this. Respect hits differently when it's no longer something you seek, but something you carry. To anyone watching this who's ever been underestimated, dismissed, or edited out of your own story, I see you. Maybe you didn't grow up in a military family. Maybe your battlefield was a boardroom, a hospital ward, a kitchen table. But you know what it's like to be overlooked until the moment they realize they needed you all along. Here's what I'll leave you with. You don't need their permission to matter. You never did. So, what about you? Have you ever kept something to yourself, your success, your struggle, just because you knew they wouldn't believe it anyway? Share your thoughts below or drop a 1 in the comments if this story hit home. And hey, where are you watching from? Let's connect. If this video moved you, if it stirred something inside you, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story. And if it didn't, tell me why. Every voice matters here.